Aging rarely announces itself through weakness. It arrives quietly, through pauses that go unanswered and chairs that remain unoffered. It begins when a voice no longer redirects the room, when a presence is acknowledged only by habit, not by attention. Long before illness appears, there is a subtler erosion. Someone can be alive, breathing, present at the table, and still be slowly erased. Eleanor Whitman existed in that space. She woke each morning at the same time she always had, folded her blanket with care, and moved through the house as if its rhythm still required her consent. Her steps were steady, her posture intact, her memory largely faithful. Nothing about her suggested absence, except the way others moved past her without adjusting their pace. She was not pushed aside. She was simply no longer waited for. The household ran efficiently. Coffee brewed, doors opened and closed, calendars dictated the day. Eleanor sat near the window most mornings, light catching the edge of her face, watching the street settle into routine. Conversations flowed around her like weather. When she spoke, replies arrived politely, sometimes with a nod, sometimes with a smile that carried no expectation of continuation. It was a courtesy, not an invitation. Meals illustrated the change most clearly. Plates were set, food was passed, schedules were discussed. Eleanor listened as plans formed and reformed, as dates were selected and revised. Holidays were arranged with admirable coordination. Travel times, guest lists, seating preferences. Her name did not enter the logistics. Not because anyone disliked her presence, but because it was assumed. She would adapt. She always had. Concern appeared regularly, dressed in softness. A hand on the shoulder when someone remembered. A question about whether she needed anything, asked while already turning away. The word itself, concern, hovered in the room like a credential. It signaled goodness without requiring follow-through. Everyone felt reassured by it. No one noticed how little it changed. There was no cruelty to point to, no raised voices or deliberate exclusions. The neglect was procedural, born of momentum. Decisions were made quickly and explained later, if at all. Eleanor learned to read outcomes instead of discussions. A new appointment appeared on the calendar. A cabinet was reorganized. A routine shifted. She adjusted quietly, the way people do when they sense resistance would only slow the day. From a distance, the house looked calm. Functional. Well managed. That distance mattered. It allowed everything to continue without reflection. It allowed smiles to substitute for listening, efficiency to replace presence. It allowed everyone to believe they were doing their best. Eleanor noticed the change without naming it. She began choosing her moments carefully, speaking only when the timing felt safe. She learned which questions would be answered and which would be acknowledged and forgotten. Her world narrowed not because it was taken from her, but because it no longer expanded in response to her. Still, she maintained her routines. She set out small reminders of herself in shared spaces, not as declarations, but as anchors. A folded newspaper. A handwritten note. A dish prepared the way she had always prepared it. These were quiet assertions of continuity. They asked nothing from anyone else. The house continued to move forward. Life does that. Birthdays passed, seasons shifted, responsibilities multiplied. Eleanor's presence became background, like a familiar piece of furniture that no one thought to move or remove. It was there, dependable, unobtrusive. What unsettled the air was not sadness, but imbalance. Something felt off, though no one articulated it. The silence around Eleanor carried a weight that did not belong to her alone. It settled into the walls, into the pauses between sentences. It lingered after conversations ended. From the outside, nothing demanded intervention. From the inside, a quiet discomfort grew, unnoticed by most. It was the kind of discomfort that does not disrupt schedules, only conscience. The kind that waits patiently for recognition. Eleanor did not ask to be seen. She had learned that asking created inconvenience. Instead, she observed. She noted how often her name was used as a reference point rather than a participant. How decisions were justified by what was assumed she would prefer. How the room recalibrated only after she had already adjusted. There was grace in her acceptance, but also a subtle grief. Not dramatic, not consuming. Just present. It lived in the spaces where her input might have gone. It settled into her evenings, when the house grew quieter and she reviewed the day without complaint. Someone else in the house noticed these patterns too. Not with judgment, not with urgency. Just with attention. That attention did not announce itself. It stayed small, patient, almost invisible. It did not interrupt the flow of the household. It simply recorded what others overlooked. While the family moved forward, certain details were being held. Not as evidence, not as accusation, but as memory. The kind of memory that waits, because it understands timing. Eleanor remained where she had always been. Alive, capable, present. And slowly, unmistakably, erased. Someone in the house noticed the pattern and stayed quiet about it. Neglect rarely announces itself as neglect. It presents as organization, as structure, as decisions made efficiently and without unnecessary friction. In Eleanor Whitman's world, exclusion did not arrive through confrontation. It arrived through process. Choices were made in rooms she was not invited into, then explained afterward in simplified language that assumed agreement. The intention was never to silence her. The outcome, however, remained the same. Family decision-making shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly. Conversations happened faster. Plans were finalized before Eleanor entered the room. When she did, she was offered conclusions instead of options. It was framed as convenience, as a way of sparing her from complexity. The narrative formed quietly. This was easier for everyone, including her. No one paused long enough to test whether that assumption was true. Paperwork became the clearest marker of the change. Forms were signed, files were organized, and documents were stored without Eleanor's involvement. Her name appeared where it was required, but her presence did not. There were folders for insurance, calendars for appointments, and notes written in handwriting that was not hers. Everything was correct. Everything was complete. Everything moved forward without interruption. Medical updates followed the same pattern. Information was summarized, distilled into manageable phrases. Test results were described as stable, follow-ups as routine. Eleanor listened, nodded, and thanked them for keeping her informed. What she was not given was space to ask questions without feeling like she was slowing things down. The system preferred efficiency over exploration. It rewarded closure, not curiosity. Efficiency began to replace empathy in ways that felt reasonable to those managing the household. Time mattered. Schedules mattered. Redundancy was avoided. Eleanor's participation was seen as optional because her resistance was minimal. She did not argue. She adapted. Her flexibility became the justification for her exclusion. Within the system, silence evolved into a rule rather than a reaction. It was understood, though never stated, that fewer questions meant smoother days. Eleanor sensed this and complied, not out of fear, but out of a lifelong habit of accommodation. She had spent decades making herself useful by staying agreeable. Now, that skill worked against her. It was during this period that Caleb Whitman began to observe more closely. He was young enough to be overlooked and quiet enough to blend into the background. He did not possess the language to describe what he noticed, but he recognized patterns. He saw how adults spoke differently when Eleanor was present. He noticed how documents appeared on counters and disappeared into drawers. He watched calendars change. Caleb did not intervene. He did not interrupt conversations or ask for explanations. He absorbed information the way children often do, without assigning immediate meaning. His attention was steady, unassuming. He watched who spoke, who decided, and who adjusted afterward. He watched Eleanor thank people for decisions she had not helped make. Documentation fascinated him. Not the content, but the process. Papers had power. They shaped outcomes without raising voices. They created permanence. Caleb noticed how much effort went into keeping everything orderly, how seriousness increased when something was written down. He learned, without instruction, that what was recorded mattered more than what was felt. Calendars dictated the household's rhythm. Files determined its memory. Routine replaced reflection. The system functioned smoothly, which reinforced its legitimacy. No one questioned a process that appeared to work. Eleanor's quiet compliance served as further confirmation that nothing was wrong. Yet something continued to feel misaligned. Not dramatically, not urgently. Just enough to register. Caleb sensed it in the pauses after Eleanor spoke, in the way adults exchanged glances before answering her questions. He sensed it in the careful tone used when discussing her needs, as though delicacy required distance. This was not cruelty. It was distance disguised as care. It was the belief that managing someone's life efficiently was the same as honoring it. The household did not see itself as neglectful. It saw itself as responsible. That belief insulated it from self-examination. Eleanor remained gracious throughout. She expressed appreciation often. She apologized when she felt she had asked too much. Her gratitude became another form of permission. It allowed the system to continue unchanged. Caleb learned patience here. He learned that not everything needed to be confronted immediately. Some things required watching, waiting, and remembering. He did not yet know why this mattered. He only knew that it did. Silence held the house together. It kept days running smoothly. It kept questions unasked. It kept discomfort manageable. But silence also preserved every detail for those who paid attention. Caleb started remembering details no one believed mattered. Caleb Whitman did not understand the household in terms of right or wrong. He understood it in terms of rhythm. He noticed how voices rose and softened depending on who entered the room, how sentences curved around certain names and flattened around others. He learned timing before he learned language. He could sense when a moment was open and when it had already closed. Eleanor's voice changed first. It grew lighter, shorter, as if shaped to fit between other people's thoughts. She spoke less because she was spoken over, not deliberately, but predictably. Her sentences were often completed for her, her questions answered before she reached the end. Over time, she began to pause more, testing the air before contributing. Caleb noticed how often those pauses ended in silence. Body language told a fuller story than words ever did. Eleanor leaned back slightly when conversations grew busy, her hands folding into themselves as if to reduce her footprint. She smiled often, a practiced expression that conveyed reassurance without expectation. Caleb learned to distinguish between smiles that invited response and those that existed to smooth the room. Eleanor's smiles increasingly belonged to the second kind. Her belongings began to shrink in visibility. A stack of books reduced to a single shelf. Personal items relocated from shared spaces to corners that required permission to access. It was not framed as removal, but as organization. Caleb watched objects move without ceremony, watched Eleanor accept the changes without protest. Her space narrowed quietly, like a hallway being repurposed. There were no confrontations. No tears marked the transition. That absence made the change harder to identify, but easier to normalize. Everything appeared calm. Functional. Eleanor did not resist, and so resistance was never considered necessary. Caleb felt the absence of conflict more acutely than conflict itself. It created a smoothness that felt unfinished. Memory began to form as a quiet archive. Caleb did not record events as stories, but as impressions. He remembered the way Eleanor waited for others to finish before speaking, even when they did not. He remembered the way concern was expressed with the same phrases, repeated across days and situations, without altering outcomes. He remembered how decisions settled into place without ever touching her hands. The word concern appeared often, always delivered gently. It arrived with softened tones and careful phrasing. It reassured everyone involved that care existed. Yet Caleb noticed how rarely it resulted in change. Concern became a signal rather than an action. It marked moments where empathy was acknowledged but not exercised. Caleb internalized patterns, not opinions. He did not assign blame or virtue. He observed cause and effect. When Eleanor spoke less, conversations moved faster. When she adjusted, routines remained uninterrupted. When she smiled, tension dissolved. The system rewarded her compliance, and the reward reinforced the behavior. He noticed timing above all else. Eleanor's contributions were most likely to be received when they aligned with existing plans. Original ideas rarely found traction. Suggestions framed as confirmations were accepted more readily than those framed as alternatives. Caleb learned this without instruction, simply by watching outcomes repeat. There was tenderness in Eleanor's acceptance, but also a quiet fatigue. Caleb sensed it in the way she lingered near doorways, unsure whether to enter. He sensed it in the way she asked permission for things she once would have done instinctively. None of this was dramatic enough to demand attention, yet it accumulated weight. The house taught Caleb patience. It taught him that silence could be strategic, that observation could be a form of participation. He learned that speaking was not the only way to be present. Sometimes, staying quiet allowed patterns to reveal themselves more clearly. Eleanor remained kind. She thanked people for their efforts. She expressed gratitude for help she had not requested. Her grace softened the edges of every interaction. It also made her easier to overlook. Caleb understood this paradox intuitively, even if he could not yet articulate it. Smiles that did not reach the eyes became familiar markers. Caleb noticed them in Eleanor, but also in others. They appeared during moments of mild discomfort, moments that passed too quickly to be addressed. The household moved on, leaving those moments behind like unfiled notes. Caleb did not yet know what he would do with what he was collecting. He only knew that it felt important to remember. His memory did not seek resolution. It sought accuracy. It held details patiently, without judgment. Years later, those memories would demand to be revisited. Time continued its steady work, unbothered by how gently it altered Eleanor Whitman's days. Her health declined without drama, not through sudden crises but through small concessions. She rested longer in the afternoons. She moved with greater care. Appointments appeared on calendars more frequently, each one framed as routine, nothing to worry about. The language around her health remained calm, deliberately reassuring, as if calm itself could serve as treatment. As the pace of daily life quickened, decisions began to accelerate. What once invited discussion now arrived as updates. Explanations shortened, trimmed to essentials that left no room for follow-up. Eleanor listened, nodded, and accepted. She had learned the rhythm well enough to know when questions would be welcomed and when they would be received as delays. Most days, she chose ease over insistence. Paperwork multiplied quietly. Legal documents joined medical forms, each one handled with care and confidence by others. Files were labeled, stored, and referenced when needed. The process was efficient, almost impressive. The family took pride in how responsibly everything was managed. There was comfort in that belief. It suggested that no mistakes were being made, that diligence equaled respect. From the outside, it appeared that everything had been handled properly. Appointments were kept. Forms were signed. Procedures were followed. The household reassured itself with checklists and confirmations. There was no sense of urgency, only completion. Eleanor's role within this structure remained passive, but that passivity was interpreted as consent. Caleb Whitman was older now, his life stretching beyond the walls of the house. Distance changed his perspective. What once felt normal began to register as specific. He no longer experienced events solely as moments, he began to recognize them as sequences. Patterns he had absorbed instinctively as a child now presented themselves as timelines. With distance came curiosity. Not the impulsive kind, but a steady, methodical interest. Caleb did not approach the past emotionally. He approached it carefully, aware that memory alone could distort truth. He understood that feelings needed anchors if they were to lead anywhere useful. Records provided those anchors. He began reviewing what existed on paper. Dates, signatures, summaries. He noticed how often decisions appeared finalized before Eleanor's involvement could reasonably have occurred. He noticed the consistency of phrasing, the repetition of assurances. Everything was documented. Everything was neat. Yet something about the alignment felt too clean, too uninterrupted. Timing started to matter. Caleb realized that certain choices were made during periods when Eleanor's capacity to respond was reduced. Not absent, just limited. The system did not exploit this deliberately, but it did not slow down to accommodate it either. Momentum favored those already moving. Silence returned to the story, heavier than before. It was no longer the silence of observation, but the silence of consolidation. The past settled into files and folders, its shape preserved but its meaning unresolved. Eleanor's presence diminished further, her world narrowing in ways that were both practical and symbolic. Caleb felt the weight of this silence differently now. As a child, silence had been a place to hide and watch. As an adult, it felt like a responsibility. He understood that timing mattered not only in decisions, but in questions. Ask too early, and nothing changes. Ask too late, and nothing can. The family continued to believe that everything had been handled correctly. That belief was reinforced by the absence of visible conflict. No one complained. No one objected. Eleanor remained gracious, expressing appreciation for the care she received. Her acceptance smoothed over any remaining doubts. Yet records do not forget what time tries to soften. They preserve sequences without emotion, but they also reveal gaps. Caleb began to see those gaps clearly. They were not dramatic. They were subtle, almost polite. But they accumulated significance. He waited. Not out of fear, but out of respect for process. He understood that evidence needed context, and context required patience. He allowed the silence to hold while he gathered clarity. This was not about accusation. It was about understanding how things had arrived where they were. When he finally spoke, it was not during an argument or a crisis. It was during an ordinary moment, surrounded by the familiar calm of routine. His question was simple, framed without challenge, grounded in timing and fact rather than feeling. It stopped the conversation cold. Caleb Whitman approached the past the way he approached everything else now, quietly and without announcement. He did not arrive with conclusions or demands. He arrived with patience. The records had always been there, waiting in drawers and folders, preserved with care. He began reviewing them not because he expected wrongdoing, but because he needed clarity that memory alone could not provide. He started with dates. Appointment logs, insurance forms, legal summaries. He placed them side by side, not to build a case, but to understand sequence. He noticed how often decisions clustered together, how certain choices followed one another without pause. The rhythm felt familiar. It matched the patterns he had absorbed as a child, now rendered in ink and timestamps. Signatures told their own story. Some appeared confidently, others mechanically. Eleanor's name surfaced where required, but rarely where influence might have mattered. Caleb did not interpret this as intent. He understood how systems worked. They favored momentum. They rewarded those already positioned to decide. Still, the consistency unsettled him. Omissions stood out more than errors. Information summarized rather than shared. Options narrowed before being presented. Caleb recognized these as efficiencies, not violations. Yet their accumulation created a narrative that felt incomplete. He did not accuse the gaps of malice. He simply acknowledged their presence. Verification became his method. He cross-referenced dates, confirmed procedures, and matched decisions to circumstances. Everything aligned with policy. Everything complied with expectation. That alignment should have been reassuring. Instead, it raised a different question. How could something feel so wrong while remaining so correct? He shared none of this initially. Not because he feared reaction, but because he respected timing. He understood that discovery did not require an audience. The truth, if it mattered, would hold its shape until it was ready to be acknowledged. He continued reviewing quietly, allowing understanding to deepen without pressure. When he eventually referenced the records, he did so gently. A question about sequence. A clarification about timing. His tone carried no accusation. It carried curiosity. The family responded with brief answers, often redirecting conversation elsewhere. Avoidance replaced defensiveness. That avoidance spoke volumes. No one argued. No one raised their voice. There was an unspoken agreement to keep things comfortable. Comfort had long been the household's currency. It smoothed interactions and preserved routine. Caleb recognized its value. He also recognized its cost. The truth aligned too cleanly. The more he verified, the less room there was for reinterpretation. Patterns emerged that no single document could explain, but together formed a coherent picture. It was not a story of harm, but of gradual exclusion. Of decisions made efficiently and accepted without resistance. Of a life adjusted quietly to fit a system that never slowed down. Emotional restraint guided him. He did not allow anger to frame his understanding. He knew that anger would simplify the narrative, and this story resisted simplicity. It required patience, nuance, and grace. Eleanor's acceptance weighed heavily on him. He saw now how her kindness had protected everyone, even as it diminished her presence. Long-game patience remained his anchor. He understood that consequences arrived not through confrontation, but through acknowledgement. The system that had overlooked Eleanor would only respond to evidence presented calmly and completely. He continued to gather, to verify, to wait. The family sensed the shift without naming it. Conversations shortened. Topics changed more quickly. There was an effort to maintain ease, to keep the past settled where it was. Caleb did not challenge this directly. He allowed the discomfort to exist without escalation. Guilt hovered quietly, not yet claimed by anyone. It did not announce itself as regret. It appeared as hesitation, as a reluctance to revisit details that had once seemed unimportant. Grace, too, remained present, though untested. The possibility of forgiveness lingered, dependent on recognition. Caleb understood that his role was not to punish, but to restore balance. The records were not weapons. They were mirrors. They reflected choices made under the assumption that no one would look closely later. Now someone was. When he finally spoke more fully, it was still without accusation. He presented what he had found with care, grounding each point in fact rather than feeling. The room grew quieter, not with shock, but with realization. The comfort that had sustained them could no longer hold. What he uncovered could not be ignored without consequences. Consequences did not arrive with raised voices or fractured relationships. They arrived through procedure, through the quiet recalibration of systems that had once moved unquestioned. Caleb Whitman understood early that if justice was going to matter, it had to be clean. Not personal. Not emotional. Correct. He began where systems listen best. Proper channels. Requests framed as clarifications rather than complaints. Records submitted with context, not commentary. He did not narrate Eleanor Whitman's pain. He allowed the documents to speak for themselves. Dates aligned. Omissions stood visible. The truth required no embellishment. Adjustments followed gradually. Files were reviewed. Notes were amended. Oversights were acknowledged without ceremony. Accountability appeared not as apology, but as correction. Policies that had once flowed in a single direction paused, then shifted. What had been assumed was now examined. What had been expedited was now reconsidered. There were no speeches. Caleb did not gather the family to explain what he had done. He did not demand recognition or understanding. He understood that explanation invites defense, and defense delays resolution. Instead, he allowed outcomes to unfold naturally, trusting that clarity would carry its own weight. The system responded because it had to. Systems do not feel guilt, but they do respond to precision. When evidence is organized and timing is right, procedure corrects itself. This was not revenge. Revenge seeks emotional satisfaction. This was restoration. Restoration seeks balance. The family felt the shift before they fully understood it. Processes that had once seemed settled were reopened. Questions returned, now formal, now unavoidable. Assumptions were gently challenged by facts. No one was accused. No one was singled out. Yet everyone was required to reconsider their version of events. Silence took on a new quality. It was no longer protective. It was reflective. Words felt inadequate where clarity now existed. The household that had once relied on comfort found itself sitting with recognition. Guilt emerged quietly, not as shame, but as awareness. Grace followed closely behind, tentative but present. Eleanor remained at the center of these changes without being placed on display. Her dignity was preserved through restraint. She was not asked to relive or recount. Her life was honored through correction, not confession. The system adjusted around her, acknowledging her presence retroactively in ways that mattered. Caleb watched this unfold with measured distance. He did not seek gratitude. He understood that real accountability rarely feels satisfying. It feels necessary. He allowed the family space to process without pressure. Acceptance, he knew, could not be rushed. As adjustments continued, the family began to reassess not just what had happened, but how it had felt to live without noticing. They recognized how easily efficiency had replaced empathy, how silence had been mistaken for agreement. These realizations did not arrive as revelations, but as slow acknowledgments that settled over time. The absence of drama made the consequences harder to dismiss. There was no argument to point to, no moment to reinterpret. The changes spoke quietly and consistently. They altered routines, expectations, and language. They made space where none had existed before. Silence now felt heavier than words because it carried meaning. It marked what had been overlooked and what had been restored. It allowed guilt to exist without spectacle and forgiveness to form without demand. The household learned that accountability did not require humiliation. It required honesty. Caleb remained patient. He understood that repair is not immediate. It unfolds in increments, through repeated choices. He did not hover. He did not remind. He trusted the process he had set in motion. Trust, he had learned, was the final act of justice. Only then did the family begin to notice something else. The constancy of Caleb's attention. The way he had observed without interfering, remembered without resenting, acted without announcing. They realized that while they had been busy maintaining comfort, someone had been watching carefully, holding space for what mattered. Only then did they realize who had been watching all along. Remembrance did not arrive as nostalgia. It arrived as clarity. Eleanor Whitman's life was not reframed through stories told at gatherings or softened recollections shared in hindsight. It was reframed through records, through actions taken quietly and consistently, through the undeniable weight of what had been restored. The truth of her presence no longer depended on memory alone. It was anchored in acknowledgement. The adjustments that followed did not dramatize her life. They honored it. Eleanor's role within the family began to reassert itself not through ceremony, but through inclusion. Decisions slowed. Her input was sought without preface or apology. Not because anyone was trying to correct the past emotionally, but because the present now required her participation. Dignity returned not as compensation, but as recognition. There were no speeches about lessons learned. No one gathered to declare change. The household simply moved differently. Chairs were pulled out without being asked. Conversations paused until Eleanor finished speaking. Her preferences were no longer inferred. They were requested. These shifts were small, almost imperceptible, but they accumulated meaning. Caleb Whitman remained steady throughout. His loyalty did not express itself through emotion or affirmation. It expressed itself through consistency. He showed up when systems required follow-through. He maintained attention long after novelty faded. He did not linger for acknowledgement. His actions spoke clearly enough. Memory, in this context, became a form of responsibility. It was no longer about what had been overlooked, but about what must now be sustained. Caleb understood that restoration without maintenance was temporary. The care he had initiated required continuity. He remained attentive not because he expected failure, but because presence mattered. Eleanor noticed the difference without commenting on it. She did not seek validation for what had changed. She accepted it with the same grace she had extended during her invisibility. That acceptance carried a quiet power. It allowed the family to adjust without defensiveness, to grow without shame. The absence of a victory tone preserved the integrity of the moment. There was nothing to celebrate in correction alone. Correction was necessary, not triumphant. The household learned to sit with that distinction. They learned that accountability could coexist with forgiveness, that guilt could transform into care rather than retreat. Calm moral clarity settled into place. It was not enforced. It emerged naturally from alignment. The family began to understand that what had been missing was not intention, but attention. Eleanor had always been there. What changed was the willingness to truly see her. Caleb's role remained understated. He did not recount what he had done or why. He allowed the results to speak quietly. His patience had created space for acceptance rather than resistance. In doing so, he preserved relationships rather than fracturing them. His loyalty honored Eleanor without isolating her. Records remained, not as reminders of failure, but as proof of care taken seriously. They no longer represented exclusion. They represented inclusion made durable. Eleanor's life was documented not to justify decisions, but to reflect participation. The household grew more reflective. Silence no longer masked discomfort. It became a pause for consideration. Conversations felt slower, more deliberate. There was warmth in that slowness. It allowed presence to replace momentum. Eleanor's dignity did not require repair. It required recognition. That recognition, once established, changed the atmosphere permanently. It reminded everyone that invisibility is not the absence of existence, but the absence of witness. Yet even as this clarity settled, something remained unresolved. Not a conflict, but an understanding still forming. A realization that extended beyond Eleanor, beyond Caleb, beyond this household. The final realization had not yet surfaced. Invisibility, the family learned, had never meant absence. It meant being present without being recognized as consequential. Eleanor Whitman had not disappeared from the household during those quiet years. She had been there, steady and attentive, adapting to a world that moved without waiting. What changed now was not her existence, but the willingness of others to meet it with intention. The meaning of invisibility shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly. It was no longer a condition imposed by age or routine. It became a question of witness. Who notices? Who remembers? Who acts when attention would be easier to withhold? The family began to understand that invisibility thrives where observation stops and dissolves where someone remains willing to look closely. Family dynamics altered in ways that could not be reversed. Not because of confrontation, but because awareness, once established, does not retreat. Conversations carried more pauses. Decisions unfolded with greater care. The pace of the household softened, not out of obligation, but out of respect. Eleanor's presence recalibrated the room simply by being acknowledged as essential. The cost of silence was finally named, though not aloud. It existed in shared understanding, in the recognition of how much had been missed by choosing ease over engagement. That cost was not paid through guilt alone, but through sustained attention. The family accepted that silence had once protected comfort, but at the expense of connection. That acceptance became the foundation for change. Eleanor's presence was re-established not through apology, but through permanence. She was included in ways that endured beyond moments of reflection. Her preferences informed plans. Her insights shaped decisions. Her voice carried weight because it was invited, not because it demanded space. This permanence mattered more than any expression of regret. It ensured that what had been corrected would remain corrected. Caleb Whitman observed this final transition with quiet resolve. He did not step forward to claim authorship of the change. He understood that justice, once complete, should recede into normalcy. His role was not to be remembered, but to ensure that Eleanor would never again be overlooked. He trusted the stability of what had been set in motion. Forgiveness emerged without ceremony. It did not require confession or absolution. It grew from consistency, from the daily choice to act differently. Guilt softened into responsibility. Grace found its place not as indulgence, but as commitment. The family learned that forgiveness is less about forgetting and more about sustaining care. Eleanor received these changes with the same quiet strength that had carried her through invisibility. She did not revisit the past or seek acknowledgement for endurance. Her acceptance was not resignation. It was peace. She had been witnessed, and that recognition restored something fundamental. It allowed her to move forward without carrying what had been lost. The house settled into reflective stillness. Not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of understanding. It held space for what had been learned and what would now be protected. There was warmth in that stillness, a sense of balance regained. The story no longer needed momentum. It had arrived where it belonged. Justice, complete and unannounced, rested within the everyday. It existed in routines that now included Eleanor by design. It lived in questions asked before decisions were finalized. It persisted in the awareness that presence demands attention, and attention demands responsibility. The family understood, finally, that invisibility is not a trait of the unseen. It is a failure of the observer. Eleanor had never been forgotten by time. She had been overlooked by habit. That distinction mattered. It reframed the entire story. As days continued and seasons turned, the household carried this understanding forward. It shaped how they noticed one another. It altered how they measured care. The lesson extended beyond Eleanor, beyond family. It settled into their way of seeing the world. Being unseen never meant being forgotten. Before you go, reflect on this. Who in your life was always present, but you only realized much later that you never truly saw them?